Imagine you're rushing through a bustling airport, impatient travelers all around, announcements echoing overhead, and then you witness a moment so shocking it demands your attention. A black woman dressed in unassuming travel attire gets shoved aside at the security checkpoint. You see the flash of anger in her eyes, and something tells you there's more to her than meets the eye. Little do the guards realize this woman holds the power to change their fate and the future of the entire airport. In the next few minutes, everything will unravel with unforgettable drama, exposing hidden agendas, secret alliances, and unexpected reckonings. Early morning sunlight filtered through the large glass panels of Maplewood International Airport. The day had barely begun, but the terminal was already brimming with activity. At the check-in counters, parents wrangled strollers, business travelers balanced coffee cups and laptops, and vacationers juggled suitcases full of souvenirs. The ambient hum of announcements, interwoven with the hiss of espresso machines, created a strangely orchestrated symphony. Everyone seemed focused on their own journey, eyes darting from phone screens to the overhead signage. Maplewood International was a busy hub, yet it prided itself on efficiency, having recently received attention for its cutting-edge security protocols, a point that local news outlets boasted about. The airport management had poured resources into state-of-the-art scanners and advanced training sessions, much of this driven by an upcoming FAA and TSA joint inspection, rumored to occur in the near future. Behind the scenes, the staff took pride in their work, but also felt the strain of operating under looming scrutiny. A culture of hush-hush pressure emanated from the top management. Keep your heads down, get the lines moving fast, and don't let anything out of the ordinary slip through. This directive echoed in the break rooms, where security officers rolled their eyes, both anxious and cynical about impending evaluations. Across a sleek corridor with polished tile floors, a discreet sign pointed to a special lounge used by VIPs and government officials. Personnel in suits, some wearing earpieces, came and went, mingling with flight attendants who had an aura of professional calm. Rumor had it that an inspector from the Federal Aviation Administration was scheduled to appear sometime this week, but no one knew exactly when or what this person looked like. As with most government inspections, mystery and unpredictability were part of the plan. Maplewood International had a heavy undertone of readiness that morning. The security teams chatted on their radios about a potential high-profile guest, while gate agents fired off quick updates on flight statuses. Baggage handlers rumbled through underground conveyors, each lost in their own sense of urgency. Little did they know that the inspector they were so meticulously preparing for had already set foot in the terminal, dressed in plain clothes blending into the crowd. She wasn't making a grand entrance. No official name tag, no entourage. The entire plan was to arrive incognito, to see the airport in its unfiltered everyday form. And so the stage was set a labyrinth of gates, escalators, and security checkpoints brimming with people from all walks of life, each with a story to tell. A day that started like any other at Maplewood International was about to become a day that none of these employees, and especially not the unsuspecting security officers, would ever forget. Her name was Dominique Campbell, though few people at Maplewood International would bother to ask. Standing at an even 5'5", with warm brown eyes and a self-possessed air, Dominique deliberately chose subtlety over flashiness. She wore a simple yet stylish navy blazer over a white blouse, dark slacks, and comfortable walking shoes. A single roller bag accompanied her, and she carried a worn folder that contained documents, some personal and some highly confidential. Dominique had spent years working her way up through the aviation industry. Raised in a close-knit family in Baltimore, she'd seen her fair share of adversity. A scholarship to a prestigious university launched her into a world where she became passionate about safety regulations and civil rights in the aviation sector. She had a knack for spotting procedural inconsistencies and addressing them before they became catastrophic issues. Over time, her diligence led her from smaller regional airports to the corridors of national authorities like the FAA. When the Federal Aviation Administration tapped her to conduct a surprise inspection of Maplewood International, it wasn't by random chance. The place had garnered headlines for both modernization and a concerning pattern of microaggressions reported by several minority travelers. Recent unconfirmed complaints mentioned rude treatment, unnecessary pat-downs, and random checks that never felt truly random to the people singled out. Because Maplewood was also heralded as a state-of-the-art facility, the administration wanted a thorough review from top to bottom of how security and customer service were being managed. Dominique accepted the assignment with her usual calm resolve. She was used to traveling alone, slipping quietly into airports across the country. Sometimes she'd appear in the guise of a business traveler, other times as a casual tourist. Today she was just a woman with a standard carry-on. Only her credentials tucked away in the side pocket of her blazer gave any hint of her real authority. As she walked through the terminal, she made mental notes, signage that was helpful, waiting lines that moved a bit too slowly, an employee who smiled warmly at her when she asked for directions. She took note of the general cleanliness and was pleased to see how bright and welcoming the renovated wing looked. However, she also noticed the uneasy tension from some security officers, as though they were on edge, scanning the crowd too intently. Dominique knew that small decisions like where to place new security scanners or how to train staff on respectful communication could make a huge difference in travelers' experiences. It wasn't just about technology and efficiency. It was about people feeling safe, respected, and valued. Her job was to see if Maplewood lived up to that mission. What she didn't anticipate was how quickly her own experience would go from routine observation to deeply personal confrontation. Like many times before, she prepared for the possibility of discrimination. But never had she expected the brazen push and dismissive arrogance she would soon encounter, especially from an airport that had touted its dedication to top-notch service. Dominique approached the primary security checkpoint for Terminal B, where lines of passengers stretched into a maze of retractable belt barriers. She watched as mothers balanced their children on hips, as older couples exchanged anxious glances about possibly missing their flights, and as a group of college students chatted animatedly about an upcoming music festival. At the podium stood Officer Jared Larkin, scanning boarding passes with mechanical efficiency. Larkin was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his uniform with a certain swagger. Beside him was a younger officer, Sabrina Hooper, whose fresh face belied her eagerness to follow protocol to the letter. Their conversation was muffled by the hum of the crowd, but Dominique could see that they were both on high alert, eyes darting across the line. As Dominique inched forward, she caught snippets of Larkin's impatient instructions to passengers. Shoes off laptops. Out. Did you not read the sign? Sir, if you don't remove your belt, we'll have to pat you down. No, ma'am. You can't bring that bottle of water through. Dispose of it now. She noticed the tone clipped even rude, yet it seemed to escalate when he addressed certain individuals, particularly those who appeared from minority groups. More invasive questions, more suspicious stares, more abrupt demands. A man of Middle Eastern descent was told twice to step aside for additional screening without clear justification. A Latina mother was grilled about the contents of a baby bottle. Dominique frowned. She'd seen enough in her career to know what subtle profiling looked like. It wasn't always blatant or over the top. Often it was hidden behind policy or regulations. She reminded herself to remain calm to assess the situation objectively. She planned to proceed through like any other passenger, take her time, and see how they treated her. When it was finally her turn, she offered Larkin a polite smile, holding out her digital boarding pass on her phone. He barely glanced at her face, focusing instead on scanning her pass. "Purpose of travel?" he asked, not meeting her eye. "I'm heading out for business," she replied, not divulging details. He nodded, but seemed unimpressed. "Remove your jacket, place it in the bin. Electronics separate." Dominique complied. She removed her blazer, careful to keep her credentials hidden in an inner pocket. She placed her laptop in a separate bin, following each instruction precisely. Then when she stepped forward to go through the body scanner, Larkin held out a hand. "Wait. I need to check something," he said. She paused, uncertain. Had something flagged on her boarding pass? Or was he fishing for a reason to single her out? He spoke into his radio. Possible additional screening needed in lane 3. Dominique's stomach tightened. She could almost see how this would play out. He would either wave her through with reluctance or send her for extra screening based on a vague, random selection. She glanced at Sabrina, who bit her lower lip, looking uneasy. But just as Larkin was about to direct Dominique into the separate lane, an elderly woman behind her suddenly stumbled. She'd lost her balance, catching her shoe on the metal lip of the conveyor belt. Dominique instinctively turned to help, steadying the woman with a gentle hand. In the confusion, Larkin barked, "Ma'am, keep moving. You're holding up the line." Dominique raised an eyebrow. She was helping someone who had nearly fallen. The older woman gave her a grateful smile, but Larkin's impatient glare was directed solely at Dominique. That moment of tension hung in the air. Dominique noticed he didn't rush the man ahead of her, or the mother behind her in quite the same tone. She took a slow breath, mentally noting everything, and she resolved to keep moving forward undeterred, even though she was certain this was only the first hint of trouble she would encounter at Maplewood International. After passing the scanner, Dominique collected her belongings. She was about to put on her blazer when another security officer approached a woman named Cheryl Baxter, wearing a rigid frown. "Step aside, please," Baxter said curtly, gesturing Dominique to a roped-off area. Dominique complied, but asked calmly, "Is there a problem? We just need to conduct a random swab of your hands and belongings." Baxter's expression remained stern. Dominique nodded, not protesting. She'd seen these random checks before. However, the manner in which Baxter spoke, like she was already convinced Dominique had done something wrong, put Dominique on edge. Baxter slid on blue gloves and beckoned with 2 fingers for Dominique to come forward. Turning to Officer Larkin, she said, "Watch that one. She looks jumpy." Her voice was audible enough for Dominique to hear, and it bristled under her skin. "I'm not jumpy," Dominique said evenly, forcing herself to maintain composure. "That's what they all say," Baxter muttered under her breath, taking out a test strip to swab Dominique's hands. The officer set it into the detection machine. While waiting for the results, she rifled through Dominique's roller bag, tossing neatly folded clothes aside. A couple of personal items clattered onto the table in plain view of passers-by. Dominique watched with growing anger as her privacy was being disregarded. She noticed Larkin and Hooper exchanging glances. Hooper looked uncomfortable, perhaps sensing the tension. Larkin's arms were crossed, standing like a guard dog. Then came the final blow. Baxter pulled out Dominique's folder of documents. Some of them were official FAA inspection checklists, discreetly bound together, but the top pages were blank so as not to reveal their true contents. Baxter thumbed through them with blatant curiosity. "Work papers?" Baxter asked. She gave Dominique a cold stare, as if searching for some hidden secret. Dominique had had enough. She reached out to take back her paperwork. "Those documents are confidential," she said, voice firm. "Please handle them with care." Baxter smirked, letting the silence linger before handing them over. "Don't worry, no security threat found in your business forms," she said mockingly. The machine beeped, showing no trace of contraband. Baxter pulled off her gloves and tossed them into a nearby bin. "You're clear," she declared, almost disappointed. Dominique exhaled slowly, feeling the heat of stares from fellow travelers who'd witnessed the humiliating display. Some gave sympathetic looks, others seemed too absorbed in their own concerns to care. Before Dominique could even secure her folder back into her bag, Officer Larkin approached with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Hurry up and get out of the way. People are waiting." Dominique took in the moment, the condescending tone, the disregard for her dignity, the underlying hostility. She resisted the urge to flash her credentials and call him out right there and then. Instead, she gathered her belongings carefully, ensuring her documents were back in order. As she walked away, her face felt hot, not just from embarrassment, but from righteous anger. This was precisely the kind of behavior the FAA had been receiving complaints about. The irony stung. She was here to conduct a fair, thorough inspection, but already she was a first-hand victim of the very problem she was meant to investigate. She promised herself right then that she would not let this go unnoticed. There was something deeply wrong in the culture of this security team, something that would have to come to light before she was done at Maplewood International. As Dominique found a quiet corner near Gate 27, she recalled the journey that brought her here. It wasn't just about being an FAA inspector. It was about personal conviction. Growing up, Dominique spent many weekends at local airports, watching planes take off and land. Her father, a postal worker, would take her to the observation deck of Thurgood Marshall Baltimore Washington International Airport, pointing out different aircraft and explaining how logistics connected people around the world. He instilled in her a sense of wonder for the skies and a respect for the institutions that made travel possible. In her teens, Dominique's mother fell ill and required frequent flights to specialized medical centers. During those travels, Dominique witnessed how some staff would go the extra mile with compassion, while others treated travelers like an inconvenience. She also saw how her mother, a black woman with limited mobility, often faced extra scrutiny at TSA checkpoints. There were moments that felt humiliating, shoes forcibly removed, while she wobbled to stand intrusive pat-downs and sometimes rude commentary. Dominique never forgot how powerless her mother looked during those times. Fueled by these experiences, Dominique pursued a degree in aviation management and policy. She excelled in her classes, particularly those on aviation law and ethics. Professors noted her meticulous approach, her eye for detail, and her unyielding drive to correct injustices. Upon graduating, she worked at several regional airports, climbing from intern roles to supervisory positions in risk management and safety compliance. Eventually, the FAA recognized her talent. She was brought on board as a junior inspector, quickly earning commendations for her thoroughness and integrity. Dominique's reputation preceded her. Over the years, she exposed several instances of airport mismanagement, from budget fraud to inadequate safety protocols. She was praised for her keen sense of fairness, never one to jump to conclusions, yet never turning a blind eye to systemic problems. For Maplewood International, the stakes were high. The new modern facility was intended to be a shining example of efficient, welcoming air travel. But if the rumors of widespread discrimination were true, it not only tarnished the airport's image, but also posed a legal risk. Moreover, it contradicted the very ethos Dominique believed in, that air travel should bridge gaps, not widen them. So this mission was personal. Dominique wasn't there just to tick boxes on a checklist. She was on a crusade to ensure that every passenger, regardless of race, gender, or ability, received respectful, diligent service. That was the essence of her role as an FAA inspector and her moral conviction as a human being. After that scathing encounter at security, Dominique felt even more resolved. If this was how they treated a well-dressed professional woman, how would they treat someone less assured or someone with fewer resources? Picturing her late mother in a wheelchair, subjected to dismissive or aggressive officers, made Dominique's blood boil. She steeled herself, reviewing her next steps. She would continue her inspection, quietly gathering evidence and observations. Then she would confront the very people who assumed she was just another traveler, showing them the power behind a name they had barely bothered to learn. While Dominique took a moment to collect herself near Gate 27, back at the security checkpoint, Officer Jared Larkin and Officer Cheryl Baxter exchanged gruff remarks about the morning's chaos. Sabrina Hooper listened with a blend of uncertainty and discomfort. Larkin was an 8-year veteran of Maplewood International's security team. Raised in a small suburban town, he'd grown up with a rigid worldview. He originally joined the Transportation Security Administration with a sense of civic duty after 9/11, believing strongly in national security. Over time, however, the daily grind wore on him. He became cynical about travelers' honesty, carrying a chip on his shoulder when it came to people who didn't follow the rules. Baxter was a more recent hire, but had quickly ascended to a senior position. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, but also a willingness to push boundaries. Some co-workers admired her efficiency. Others complained that she'd crossed the line into harassment. She justified her harsh methods with better safe than sorry, ignoring the fact that her safety measures disproportionately targeted minorities. Then there was Sabrina Hooper, who had joined the team straight out of community college. She was idealistic and wanted to do the right thing, but found herself torn between the rigid protocols hammered into her during training and her innate sense of empathy. Whenever she hesitated to send a traveler to secondary, screening Baxter or Larkin would bark at her for being soft. Management at Maplewood International, in a bid to bolster its reputation, had recently increased performance expectations for security. They set benchmarks for how quickly lines should move and how thoroughly staff must screen passengers. The unspoken directive was to catch anything that might even remotely be a threat. Meanwhile, a culture of micromanagement had filtered down from the top pressuring officers to look for easy targets. Caught in the crossfire, the security team had devolved into factions, some wanting to uphold ethical standards, and others fixated on numbers and rigid interpretations of rules. This environment subtly validated biases like Larkin's and Baxter's, allowing them to act on personal prejudices under the guise of enforcing regulations. The leadership rarely intervened unless passenger complaints threatened to go public. Even then, officers like Larkin, who had seniority, often got a slap on the wrist rather than meaningful corrective action. Baxter, with her near-perfect record of finding prohibited items, was praised by superiors who never dug deeper into how she selected her subjects. So when Dominique passed through, it was almost reflexive for Larkin and Baxter to single her out. To them, she fit some vague notion of someone who might cause trouble. They never paused to question whether their approach was unfair or harmful. It was standard operating procedure, and Maplewood's rushed numbers-driven security culture only emboldened them. Yet in time, their actions would come back to haunt them. The woman they mistreated was not just another traveler. They had unknowingly targeted the very person responsible for evaluating their procedures. The stage was set for an explosive reckoning. Dominique spotted a vacant seat among clusters of passengers at gate 27. She set her roller bag beside her and slid out her phone, double-checking the schedule. She was supposed to meet a contact, someone inside Maplewood International, who had been feeding the FAA anonymous tips about questionable conduct. The plan was for them to meet in the staff cafeteria during a coffee break. Before heading there, Dominique composed an email on her phone to a colleague at FAA headquarters. She detailed the morning's events, taking care not to let her indignation cloud the facts. Her colleague Wesley Chen was also an inspector who specialized in compliance training. She needed him on standby if things escalated, and she had a sneaking suspicion they would. Around her, an announcement rang out for a flight boarding to Dallas. Passengers shuffled into line, and the typical last-minute rush of overhead bin space arguments ensued. Dominique noted it all, every snippet of tension, every anxious glance. An airport was a microcosm of humanity, and Maplewood's brand was tarnished by staff whose suspicion overrode compassion. Pushing her chair back, Dominique proceeded down a corridor that led to the employees-only section of the airport. She flashed a special pass she carried for official inspections, one that allowed her behind the scenes. Though her official identity remained concealed from most, she could still navigate staff areas under the guise of Airport Operations Liaison, a vague title that typically avoided drawing suspicion. The staff cafeteria was a modest space with pale yellow walls and rows of plastic chairs. A faint smell of microwave-heated meals hung in the air, mingling with the burnt coffee odor emanating from an industrial-sized coffee maker. A few employees were scattered about, maintenance workers, airline staff on break, and a pair of flight attendants reviewing their schedule. Dominique searched the faces for anyone who might match the cryptic description her inside contact had given. "I'll be the one with the bright turquoise lanyard." Sure enough, seated at a table near a poster reminding employees of security protocols was a figure wearing that telltale lanyard. She approached cautiously and took a seat across from the contact, a slender man with curly hair and glasses. He introduced himself quietly. Marcus Fielding. You must be—" Dominique nodded. "Dominique, thank you for agreeing to meet." They spoke in hushed tones. Marcus explained that he worked in airport operations, focusing on compliance with federal guidelines. He'd seen more complaints pile up than usual, especially complaints revolving around racial profiling. An internal complaint process existed, but he felt it was toothless. Each time he escalated concerns, they were brushed aside or given lip service. Marcus leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea how bad it is. The managers want numbers. They want to see how many people get searched, how many red flags are reported. And some officers like Larkin and Baxter get a kick out of using that system to justify unfair behavior." Dominique's jaw clenched, but she kept her composure. "Have there been any major incidents swept under the rug?" Marcus nodded grimly. He detailed a recent case involving a young black man traveling with expensive camera equipment. Security had accused him of trying to smuggle contraband because they found a small battery pack. He was detained for hours, missing his flight. Only after a higher-up in the airline intervened did they release him, but it never made it to official records. "All this is documented here," Marcus said, sliding a USB drive across the table. "I've got logs, staff rosters, even some internal memos." Dominique pocketed the USB drive discreetly. "Thank you. This will help ensure our investigation is thorough. There are good people here who want change. But it can't happen if the leadership remains complicit." Marcus glanced around, anxiety etched in his features. "Just be careful. Some of these folks are eager to cover their tracks. If they realize who you really are, they might try to bury you in red tape or worse." Dominique offered a reassuring smile. "I've dealt with worse, but I appreciate the warning. And your courage." As she left the cafeteria, heart pounding with renewed determination, Dominique realized the stakes were far higher than she initially imagined. The question was no longer whether Maplewood International had systemic issues. It was how deep they went, and whether the impending showdown would bring the truth to light before more innocent travelers were harmed. Clutching the USB drive, Dominique made her way toward a quiet hallway behind a set of unmarked doors. She needed to find a secure spot to review the files. Along the way, she passed a small cluster of personnel offices. On the frosted glass doors were titles like Human Resources, Operations Management, and Security Administration. One door caught her eye, Internal Compliance. She paused for a moment, contemplating whether to peek inside. But Marcus had warned her about the complacency at higher levels. If the chain of command was compromised, stepping into internal compliance could alert the wrong people to her presence. She decided to keep a low profile and continued on. Turning a corner, she found a deserted break area with a couple of vending machines humming quietly. She sat at a metal table laptop, opened the USB drive plugged in. One by one, she opened the files, incident reports, emails, memos. As she skimmed through them, her stomach churned. There were accounts of travelers singled out with vague language, suspicious behavior, unusual attire, abnormal nervousness. But the descriptions often mentioned race implicitly. Words like urban street or foreign thrown in without cause. A pattern of disciplinary action was recommended for some officers, but each recommendation was mysteriously dropped at the last minute. Dominique recognized that for every incident recorded here, countless others probably went undocumented. The pattern was undeniable, revealing a systemic issue with both the screening methods and the management's oversight. Her thoughts were interrupted when Sabrina Hooper, the younger officer, appeared in the break area, presumably on her own break. She looked tired, her posture slumped. Noticing Dominique, she hesitated, then awkwardly waved hello. Dominique closed her laptop. She smiled politely. "Long day," Sabrina nodded, rubbing her temple. "You could say that. We're always short-staffed lately, and everything is about efficiency. Sometimes I feel, I don't know, torn, I guess." Dominique raised an eyebrow, sensing an opportunity. Torn how Sabrina sighed. "I became a security officer to help keep people safe. But sometimes I see how certain individuals are treated, and it doesn't feel right. It's not exactly official policy, but there's this unspoken rule. Certain profiles get more scrutiny. Then we're told to keep lines moving, so we cut corners for others. It's unfair." Dominique kept her expression neutral, though inside she felt a pang of empathy for Sabrina. "Have you shared these concerns with your supervisors?" Sabrina let out a humorless laugh. "I did once. A few days later, I got my schedule changed to the worst hours, and one of the senior officers, Baxter, started making my life hell." Dominique nodded solemnly. She chose her words carefully. "Sometimes positive change comes from within. Maybe if enough people speak up together." "Management doesn't want to hear it," Sabrina interjected, shaking her head. "They care about numbers, not fairness. And if you rock the boat, you're out." A moment of silence passed. Dominique could see the vulnerability in Sabrina's eyes. She was a potential ally, someone who wanted to do the right thing, but lacked the protection to do so. Dominique offered a small but sincere smile. "For what it's worth, I believe people like you can make a difference. You see what's wrong. Others might too." Sabrina looked both grateful and conflicted. She glanced at the clock on her phone, then stood. "I have to get back to my station. If you ever need help navigating, well, anything, let me know." Dominique's eyes followed Sabrina as she left a glimmer of hope sparking in her chest. It was clear that while Maplewood's system had serious flaws, there were still individuals on the inside who opposed the status quo. Allies like Sabrina, and certainly Marcus, might be the key to unraveling the web of prejudice and intimidation that plagued this airport. Later that afternoon, Dominique decided it was time to test the waters more publicly. She'd gathered enough evidence of discriminatory practices, and now she wanted to see how certain staff would react if pressed. She returned to the security checkpoint, this time observing from a distance. She watched as Larkin berated a passenger for not removing a belt, even though the signage had been unclear. Baxter, on the other side, was busy herding another passenger to a secondary screening for what seemed like a trivial reason, a passport stamp from a Middle Eastern country. After several minutes, Dominique approached the security area. Larkin's eyes fell on her, immediately recognizing her from before. "You again," he muttered, stepping forward. She gave him a courteous nod. "Hello, officer. I'd like to speak with your supervisor." Larkin's brow furrowed. "About what I have concerns regarding the screening process," she replied, keeping her tone measured. Baxter, who overheard the conversation, approached with a smug look. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" "Yes, I believe there is," Dominique said, meeting Baxter's gaze. "I've noticed inconsistent screening procedures and potential profiling. I'd like to formally lodge a complaint." Baxter stiffened. "You can file a complaint online, or there's a form over by the administrative office. We're busy here." Dominique offered a polite smile. "I'd prefer to speak with a supervisor in person." Before either officer could respond, a man wearing a tie and a badge that read, "Security Lead." Charles Roth stepped over. He wore an expression that suggested he'd been informed of the commotion by radio. "What's going on here?" Roth asked, looking from Dominique to Larkin and Baxter. Dominique took the initiative. "I was requesting a discussion with a supervisor regarding discriminatory and overly aggressive screening procedures." Roth raised an eyebrow at Larkin and Baxter. "We do not discriminate," he replied, his tone flat, almost recited. "Is there an incident you'd like to report?" "Yes," Dominique said, voice unwavering. "Multiple incidents, in fact. Not just against me, but against other travelers, particularly those of color or with certain backgrounds. I have documentation." Baxter scoffed. Larkin crossed his arms, glaring. "What documentation?" he challenged. Dominique paused, her eyes locking onto Roth's. "Let me be clear. I'm not an ordinary passenger. I'm here on behalf of the Federal Aviation Administration to assess Maplewood International's adherence to federal guidelines, including fair and equal treatment. So I'd advise you to take my concerns seriously." A hush fell over the area. Passengers paused in their hustle, sensing tension. Roth's face turned ashen. Larkin and Baxter exchanged anxious looks. Even Sabrina, stationed a few feet away, stared wide-eyed, her mouth slightly open in surprise. Finally, Roth recovered his composure. "Well, perhaps we should take this discussion somewhere private." Dominique nodded. "I agree." Larkin, who had been so confident moments before, now seemed to shrink under the weight of Dominique's revelation. Baxter's smugness dissolved into apprehension. Dominique followed Roth away from the security lines, satisfied that she had finally torn down the facade that had permitted officers to hide behind their uniforms. But she also knew this was just the beginning of a bigger storm. The real battle was about to unfold in offices where bureaucratic language could either conceal wrongdoing or expose it for all to see. The conference room near the security administration wing of Maplewood International was about as sterile and uninspiring as any Dominique had ever seen. It was lit by harsh fluorescence. The walls were bare, except for a faded clock and a framed poster of a nondescript beach. The air smelled faintly of old carpet and industrial coffee. It wasn't the kind of room designed for revelations, but that was exactly what Dominique had in store. Seated across from her was Charles Roth, the security lead. His pale blue tie was slightly crooked, and a faint sheen of sweat glistened on his brow. He kept glancing between Dominique's badge, which now lay fully visible on the table, and the printed credentials she had placed beside it, clear, irrefutable proof of who she was. "Let me get this straight," he said after a long pause. "You've been on site since yesterday?" "Yes," Dominique replied calmly. "And in that time, I was pushed aside at security, condescended to, and subjected to an unnecessary secondary screening by officers who had no legitimate cause. I also overheard discriminatory remarks and personally witnessed several questionable screenings, including one where a Middle Eastern passenger was pulled aside twice without explanation." Roth shifted in his chair. "Ms. Campbell, I understand your concerns truly, but surely you understand how high pressure this environment can be. These officers are under tremendous stress." Dominique's expression didn't waver. "I'm not here to evaluate their stress levels. I'm here to assess whether your team is upholding federal regulations and whether this airport treats passengers fairly regardless of their race or background. And based on my experience so far, the answer is no." The silence in the room thickened. Roth opened a drawer, pulled out a notebook, and began jotting notes. "Look, I'm not making excuses. If there have been violations, we'll handle them. But a lot of what you're describing, tone, attitude, it's subjective. It's hard to enforce policy around perceptions." "Except when the perception becomes pattern," Dominique replied sharply. "And that's what I've been seeing, patterned behavior, reinforced by poor leadership and unchecked authority." Just then the door swung open. Margaret Hastings, the airport's head of security, entered with the clipped stride of someone who didn't have time for introductions. She was tall, silver-haired, with a no-nonsense air, and a steely gaze that had likely intimidated more than one underperforming manager over the years. "Ms. Campbell," she said, eyes flicking to Dominique's ID on the table. "So it's true. We've got an FAA inspector on the ground." Dominique stood and extended her hand. "Ms. Hastings, I appreciate you making the time." Hastings shook her hand firmly, then sat beside Roth. "I've been briefed on the basics. I'd like to hear it from you directly." So Dominique laid it out methodically and without embellishment. Her tone was firm but measured. She described the mishandling at the checkpoint, the overt dismissiveness, the profile-driven behavior. She didn't shy away from naming Larkin and Baxter, and she emphasized the implications not just legal, but cultural. If passengers of color were disproportionately targeted and publicly embarrassed, it wasn't just a bad look for the airport, it was a civil rights issue. A liability. Hastings listened in silence. When Dominique finished, she folded her hands atop the table. "I won't deny," she said slowly, "that we've had performance issues. I've received complaints about Officer Larkin before, Baxter too. But there's a difference between poor judgment and systemic failure. There is, Dominique agreed, but you don't get at one without enabling the other. Hastings gave her a long look. What are you recommending? I'm formally submitting Maplewood International into a compliance review window, Dominique said. Which means additional audits, additional FAA oversight, and potentially, if things don't improve, sanctions. Roth paled visibly. Hastings's jaw tightened. I'd also recommend immediate administrative leave for the officers involved, Dominique continued. Pending investigation and a top-down re-evaluation of your internal training, particularly around implicit bias and communication. Hastings exhaled. That won't sit well with the union. It never does, Dominique replied. But this isn't about comfort. It's about accountability. Roth interjected, his voice taut. May I ask, are you planning to go public with your findings? Dominique looked him squarely in the eye. If I have to. There was a knock at the door. An assistant entered, whispering something into Hastings's ear. She stood. Excuse me. Officers Larkin and Baxter have been asked to report to my office. I'll handle it from here. As the door closed behind Hastings, Roth slumped slightly in his chair. I'll admit, he said quietly, you caught us off guard. That was the point, Dominique replied. I didn't come here to stage a scene. I came to see your team as they really are. And now, she said, gathering her folder and ID, you have a decision to make. Are you going to defend the status quo? Or are you going to help fix what's broken? Roth didn't answer. But Dominique didn't need him to. Not yet. Outside the conference room, the airport seemed to pulse with new awareness. Word had started to spread. Officers moved with more intention. Supervisors watched the floor more closely. Dominique could feel the gears shifting ever so slightly, and she knew this was only the beginning. The news spread through Maplewood International like a thunderclap. An FAA inspector had come through undercover. Not in uniform, not in a briefing. But right there, quiet, composed, dressed like any other traveler. And she had seen everything. Dominique Campbell's name now echoed in hushed tones through the break rooms, the security offices, and the upper levels of airport management. Officers who had ignored her, dismissed her, or pushed her aside, now whispered nervously as her identity became clear. Word reached the security floor just after lunch. A hastily scheduled closed-door meeting was convened, and within the hour both Officer Jared Larkin and Officer Cheryl Baxter were summoned to report to the director's office. The same officers who had waved off Dominique as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience were now facing the weight of consequences they hadn't imagined possible. Officer Larkin walked in first, his usual swagger noticeably thinner. Hastings, the head of airport security, sat at the head of the conference table. Her expression was unreadable, but her silence pressed like a vice. Officer Larkin, she began. You are aware of the surprise FAA inspection we underwent yesterday? Larkin gave a stiff nod. Yes, ma'am. And are you aware, she continued slowly, that the woman you barked at, pushed aside and dismissed was the inspector herself? Larkin's face paled. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Hastings didn't wait for a response. Your conduct has been flagged in the official report, and not just from yesterday. We've reviewed months of complaints tied to your ID number, racial profiling, unwarranted secondary screenings, aggressive tone, demeaning comments. He tried to defend himself. I was following protocol. We're told to act fast, to stay sharp. If someone seems off. "Is that what you call a woman? Helping an elderly passenger who tripped off?" Hastings' asked, voice suddenly sharp. "Because your actions that morning showed anything but discernment. They showed bias, and now it's come full circle." Larkin swallowed hard, his confidence now a shrinking echo. Then it was Baxter's turn. She entered the room with her usual defiant glare, but that melted quickly when Hastings read off a series of complaints. "There's a pattern," Hastings said flatly. "You disproportionately refer women of color to secondary screenings. You mock passengers under your breath. You've rifled through belongings with no regard for privacy or professionalism." Baxter crossed her arms. "Passengers exaggerate. They're always looking for something to complain about." Hastings slid a printed email across the table. "This one wasn't written by a passenger. It's from your colleague Officer Sabrina Hooper." Baxter's lips parted, stunned. "She witnessed your remarks. She's submitted a sworn statement detailing your behavior. And this time, you don't get to brush it off." Back in the hallway, word traveled fast. Larkin and Baxter had been suspended indefinitely, pending an investigation that now involved federal oversight. Some officers exchanged silent glances of relief. Others avoided eye contact altogether. For those who had long endured the toxic culture that Larkin and Baxter perpetuated, the shift was palpable. The power structure had cracked, and through that crack change was pushing its way forward. Dominique, meanwhile, continued her inspection, calm, focused, but not detached. She visited other wings of the airport. She observed interactions at gates, checked compliance logs, and reviewed how accessibility requests were handled. And at every turn, staff now approached her with a different energy, one of curiosity, caution, and quiet deference. When she passed by the same checkpoint where she had been humiliated, she noticed something remarkable. A new officer was posted at the scanner, a woman in her mid-40s with a kind expression. She gently guided a nervous traveler through the process, explaining each step with clarity and respect. Dominique paused to watch just for a moment. This is what it should have been all along. In a conference room upstairs, Hastings convened a staff leadership meeting. "We are implementing full retraining across departments," she announced. "Not just on security procedures, but on de-escalation, implicit bias, and respectful communication." There were no groans, no complaints, only nods. The karmic wheel had turned, and Maplewood International was on the verge of transformation. Dominique's actions had done more than just remove two problematic officers. She had exposed a culture of apathy and hidden prejudice. She had lit a fire under a system that had grown too comfortable, too unchecked, and in doing so, she'd restored something that had been quietly missing for too long: accountability. The quiet observation deck overlooking the runways at Maplewood International felt like a world away from the chaos of security checkpoints and administrative offices. The room was nearly empty, save for a few employees on break. A line of windows stretched across the far wall, offering a panoramic view of the airfield. Beyond, the glass planes lifted into the sky like silver prayers, each one carrying stories, people, intentions. Dominique stood alone at the railing, her hands resting lightly on the cool metal. After everything that had transpired over the past 48 hours, anonymity, shattered protocols, broken truths, unearthed, this moment felt necessary. She needed space to breathe, to think, to feel. She watched a jet roll slowly toward takeoff. Its engines humming low, the nose pointed toward the horizon. For the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to feel the fatigue pressing into her bones. She was proud of what she had accomplished, but she was also tired. Exposing misconduct, holding institutions accountable, navigating layers of arrogance and denial, it had taken a toll. And yet she wouldn't have chosen any other path. Her thoughts turned back to the very beginning, the moment she stepped into Maplewood, posing as just another traveler. The cold push from a security officer, the humiliating search, the careless words, the assumptions, the hostility. It had all come so fast, and yet it was all so familiar. Dominique had long ago learned that even power couldn't shield her from the reach of bias. That's why she had fought so hard to earn it, to wield it for those who hadn't been given the chance. And now, standing here in a quiet corner of the very airport she had just helped unravel, she reflected on how close it had all come to being swept under the rug again. She thought of Marcus, the quiet whistleblower who risked everything to hand her that USB drive. She thought of Sabrina, the young officer who carried a conscience but feared retaliation. And she thought of the countless travelers who had passed through Maplewood's gates, mistreated or dismissed with no recourse but to swallow their indignity and keep moving. Dominique's phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from Wesley Chen, her colleague at the FAA, heard the reports in progress. Incredible work, Dominique. You made a difference again. A smile ghosted across her lips. She typed a quick reply. Still feels like just the beginning. Sliding the phone back into her coat, Dominique looked once more across the tarmac. A familiar movement caught her eye. Down below near Gate 12, she spotted Sabrina helping a passenger in a wheelchair navigate through security. The younger officer moved with care, gently guiding, patiently explaining. Dominique watched with quiet satisfaction. Change had already begun. Small, maybe, but real. Later, as she made her final loop through the terminal, Dominique noted subtle differences. Staff were speaking with clearer tones. Instructions were more measured. New signage had gone up near the checkpoint, reminding employees of the airport's zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. And though it would take more than signs to change behavior, Dominique saw it as a step forward. She passed by Baxter's old post. Empty now. The smugness that once ruled the lane was gone. Larkin, too, had vanished from sight, suspended pending the investigation. In their absence, the space felt less tense, less dangerous. Dominique approached the exit, slowly letting her steps carry the weight of everything she had done. She had not come to Maplewood seeking confrontation, but confrontation had found her. And through it, a system had been exposed. Policies would be reviewed, officers retrained, accountability demanded. She glanced one last time over her shoulder, the airport humming around her. Behind those walls, passengers hurried to gates. Families reunited, business trips began. Life went on. But thanks to her, it might go on with a little more fairness, a little more dignity. The automatic doors whooshed open, and cool air greeted her like a baptism. Dominique stepped out into the afternoon light, her spine straight, her heart steady. There would be another airport, another assignment, another place where silence hid injustice. But today, Maplewood International had changed, and so had she. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Maplewood International Airport, where one woman's courage exposed a deeply flawed system. Dominique Campbell's story reminds us that injustice can persist when disguised as procedure, and that meaningful change happens when ordinary people refuse to stay silent. While the confrontations at Maplewood were dramatic, they reflect a reality for many who face biases every day. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to like, share, and subscribe. Spread the word, spark conversations, and stay vigilant against discrimination in any form. Your engagement isn't just about supporting this channel. It's about championing fairness and equality in our institutions. Let's keep these issues in the spotlight so we can work toward a world where everyone is treated with respect, no matter where they fly. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more compelling stories and powerful truths.